I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for sticking around for the third day of the 10th anniversary Healing Our Waters Conference. My name is Frank Szollosi. I'm with National Wildlife Federation, our Great Lakes office in Ann Arbor. I manage regional outreach campaigns. I've been with National Wildlife Federation for about 5 years. I live in Toledo, Ohio. This is the hashtag we're going to be using for folks on social media, wind energy. It's also the hashtag How10. We are being recorded. We're going to have time for question and answers. This is going to live stream at 9:45 this morning, so there's going to be somewhat of a tape delay. But if you think that anybody back in your world would like to hear this presentation with these great speakers, you can let them know that this is going to be live streaming at 9:45 this morning. The matter of offshore wind in the Great Lakes can be a very polarizing concept to some. It certainly has been on the eastern seaboard, where two major projects are about to get underway as far as construction goes. A project off Block Island, and of course the other one being Cape Wind. The United States is lagging in developing this technology and deploying this technology. There are offshore wind farms off the coast of Europe, and there's some planned for, actually I think there's some in the water in Asia as well. National Wildlife Federation, one of our chief concerns is obviously our middle name, our wildlife. And so whether it's offshore wind, onshore wind, or any type of energy siting, we want to make sure that it's done in a way that does not contribute to cumulative negative effects for wildlife and habitat. That said, as one of our sister organizations, the National Audubon Society, just pointed out in an excellent report released just this week, North American birds are threatened by climate change. And in the Great Lakes, our power sector contributes a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas pollution. If you look at the Energy Information Agency's tables for carbon pollution, the states around the Great Lakes contribute both per capita and as a total volume just a tremendous amount, the most amount of greenhouse gas pollution compared to other parts of the country. So we believe that we have a moral obligation to find and to restructure how we produce energy in a way that combats climate change, reduces the threats to birds, to fish, to the Great Lakes. And that has us considering our approach to offshore wind in the Great Lakes. National Wildlife Federation has endorsed the projects off Block Island and Cape Wind. We're here today to hear from folks who are real practitioners and leaders in this field. First, we're going to hear from Dave Karpinski. He's vice president at LEEDCO, which is an acronym for the Lake Erie Energy Development Corporation, based in Cleveland, Ohio. He's been their vice president since 2009, after being the head of research and development at Nortec, and has led engineering and R&D for other manufacturers in Ohio. And he's a graduate of the Ohio State University. We're also going to hear from Liesl Clark.
That went over okay.
We're also going to hear from Liesl Clark, who spent 8 years in Michigan government. She was in the Senate policy staff. She was a high-ranking official in the Department of Agriculture, and then where she really demonstrated great public service and innovation was as deputy director of the Energy Department here in Michigan during the time when a lot of resources were coming into Michigan from the federal government and from the private sector to really innovate Michigan's energy economy. And so she's a partner now at 5 Lakes Energy, which is a a major energy consulting concern here in the Great Lakes. So we're going to hear from both of those. We have a third panelist who has been detained, not yet arrived. But after that, we'll hear questions from folks. So hopefully we can get this going. And without any further ado, Dave, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Frank.
Absolutely. All you have to do is hit beginning.
Okay. From the beginning, let's see, right there.
Right there.
There we go.
Yeah.
With my glass on the table, it's a problem. Well, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Frank. And it's a topic we always enjoy talking about. We're very interested in being able to kind of get the message out and just to share the way we're looking at this situation and really try to continue the dialogue and get to the point where I think we can come to a common solution and some consensus. So as Frank said, we're a group based out of Ohio. We're in Cleveland. We really represent kind of Northeast Ohio, and those kind of 4 counties along the lake are our founding members. We're kind of an interesting animal. We're really a developer, but we're a nonprofit developer. So we really started this public-private partnership, and the idea was that if we can get the 4 lakefront counties where we see most of the wind development happening in Ohio, kind of arm in arm, that they kind of control access to the lake. I won't get into all the legal, but they can kind of control who does what in the lake in front of their waters. If we get them arm in arm, we can really do this in a way that is in the best interest of the citizens of the region. The alternative we saw was if we didn't do that, then we'd have developers coming in one by one and maybe pitting each county against the other county and really not looking at the best interest of this for the whole state and the region, but for their individual interests. So that's why we're formed. Our goal has always been kind of this, 2 pieces of it: the economic development that comes from developing a new energy infrastructure, but the clean energy sources in Ohio, which we don't have much of. And I'll talk quite a bit about where we stand in Ohio in that sense. So that's kind of who we are. Let me talk about why we're thinking about this. It's great to have economic development benefits, but if there's no market for what you're developing, it's not really going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. We believe there's a market outlook for offshore wind, and let me just walk you through a little bit about why we think that. In Ohio, we have a huge fleet of coal plants. Some people are very proud of that. Some people aren't so proud of that. But basically, that's really our legacy. We have, I'll show a little slide later, we have almost 80% of our power comes from coal. So we've got this legacy of coal, and everybody knows today that the pressures on coal are mounting. I mean, from a host of reasons. You can talk about the war on coal. I think it's a war on dirty air is the way I like to look at it. But whatever you want to look at, if you want to look at the gas prices that are putting pressure on coal, just the age of these plants is starting to get to that. I mean, most of these plants were built over 50 years ago. So at any rate, there's this big gap that's created, right? If you had 24 gigawatts, and when we look at what the EPA MATS rules have already announced, 70 gigawatts of announced closures, we can name the plants, and you look at the Clean Power Plan role and what projections are there, it's another 10 or 11 in Ohio is the way we look at it. So there's this huge gap coming, and the question is, well, we're not going to stop using electricity, so what fills that gap? Certainly natural gas. I mean, it's hard to not see what's happening with the shale gas boom, and clearly that's the most dominant probably force. But our view is it can't replace it all. We don't want it to replace it all. We don't want to end up with a substitution of one fossil fuel with another. Granted, natural gas is a lot better. It's a lot cleaner. But at the end of the day, it's still natural gas. It's still a fossil fuel. So it's half the carbon is coal, and it still is a limited, finite resource that the price is volatile over time. So we're saying, okay, it's not going to take it all, so what's left then? Well, when you look at what the other resources are, nuclear, there's no plans for any new nuclear in Ohio. And I'm speaking a lot about Ohio because that's really what we studied quite a bit, right? This is an interesting map. A few consulting firms in the wind industry got together a couple years, and this has been developing over a few years, but what they looked at was in the PJM grid, which is where we are, kind of points in Ohio and some of Michigan and East, about 13 states, said how we're going to handle the penetration of renewable energy if it really starts to play out. So a lot of groups got together and studied where are the wind resources and where could wind sites be sited to make up for this. So these aren't plans, these aren't projects that are in place, these are kind of theoretical. When you look at the wind resources across this area, where are they? So if you look at where we are here, western Ohio and west and into Indiana, Illinois, you've got some pretty good wind on the land, right? If you look in east of Ohio, along the ridge in PA and West Virginia, you have some wind, and then you go further east and you have all this offshore wind in the east coast. But you look at this area here, which is central Ohio and western PA, and there's really no good land-based resource. The solar resource in that part of our state, Ohio is among the lowest in the country. So it's not going to come from solar, majorly. There's going to be a contribution from land-based wind in the northwest for sure. It's not going to be biomass. It's not going to be new nukes. So where's it coming from? When you look at what we have in the Great Lakes, in Lake Erie, and we've got a tremendous resource of wind. So we think that all these things mitigate toward offshore wind playing a role in filling that gap. So we're kind of saying, okay, if land-based wind takes a gig and a half of that gap, then maybe offshore wind takes about 3. Again, these numbers are going to be, I think, scrutinized and developed over time as we go through the Clean Power Plan rule. But I think at the end of the day, we say there's a legitimate argument that there's a demand for some other source beyond gas in Ohio to fill this gap that coal's going to leave. So that's kind of why we're doing it. You got to have some basis, or nothing else is going to matter anyhow. No matter how much you want to do it, if you can't have a commercially viable economic driver to do it, it's not going to happen. So that's kind of why. Let me tell you what we're doing, get to some of the details. Our goal is to create a large industry that's going to drive economic impact and energy at scale. Well, you don't do that in one step. So our whole strategy from the beginning has been, we need to start with a modest pilot project. And really, although this has been done in Europe, it hasn't been done in Lake Erie. It hasn't been done in Cleveland. So we have to, it's very prudent to start small, right? And let's prove everything out. Let's prove out how we permit, something like this that's never been done. Let's prove out how we leverage our marine infrastructure to get it constructed. Let's prove out, how we get the cable laid and what resource we have there. So the idea was always, let's start small. Let's learn. Let's, anybody kind of, I come from the manufacturing background. You never come out with a new product in the lab and then scale it up, right out of the chutes. There's always this idea of piloting something, and that's what this is. It's a pilot project. We call it Icebreaker, kind of a play on the name. We do have ice in Lake Erie, and that's one of the challenges that we're overcoming. It's pretty much an engineering challenge, but so technically it's an icebreaker. Politically it's breaking the ice on offshore wind in Lake Erie, so it's kind of cute. Can you hear my water there, Frank?
Absolutely.
So it consists of 6 turbines right now, 7 miles off the coast of Cleveland. It's relatively shallow water. That's what we have in Lake Erie, which is very conducive to offshore wind, kind of keeps the cost down. It's about, the hub height will be 85 meters, which is pretty large scale. It's not the largest now that's coming offshore, but it's pretty good size. And enough power to power about 5,500 homes. So that's the path we're on. You can see we're situated really right outside of Cleveland, 7 miles off. You can't really see them very well. We did our photo simulations, and 7 miles is a long way out there, so there's really not a lot of view shed impact at this point. Okay, so that's kind of just the basics of the project. Let me talk about, I think, a concern that NWF has, and a lot of our stakeholders have had. We've looked at the environmental impacts very seriously. We're not looking at this as what's the least we can do to get it permitted. We're really, we have a lot of stakeholders that formed us that are interested in an environmentally friendly approach here. So it's kind of in our DNA. Having said that, we're also very, most of us are engineers that are kind of part of this, so we're very data driven. So what we wanted to do is we looked at the data. So what information's out there that we can learn from, that we can start to project what kind of impact has wind had, what can we learn from that, and try to project what kind of impact our wind farm will have. And in recent years, there's been a lot of information studies. I mean, this is just kind of the summary at the bottom. 117 separate publications, 259 researchers, 38 peer-reviewed journals. So this isn't, blogs, and these are some serious studies. Again, you can look at all those. Each one of those is the 117 different publications out there over 10 years. And our conclusion, when you look at that, it tells you a lot of things. I mean, it studies mortality rates, it studies migration paths, presence of species, all kind of different things. Our conclusion is, when we look at all that information, that our project in Lake Erie and Great Lakes is going to have a negligible impact on wildlife at this point. and have significant benefits of leading toward addressing the problem that Frank mentioned, which is how do we get clean energy sources. So why do we say that? Certainly, it's not that no wind farms have ever had negative impacts. It's all about what have we learned about that? What have these taught us about that? And there's a lot of learning that we've had from some of the bad experiences in wind that help us inform how we sited this one. Number one, we're 7 miles out, not a lot of avian activity. Some water birds are there, but not much habitat, so there's really no habitat impact. The migration paths are much further west. In majority, there are some migration paths over that part of the lake for songbirds, but they're very high, is what the data shows, well above where the rotor would be. So that's kind of what we continue to look at and continue to try to drive and collect and learn, and our goal is to really kind of learn as much as we can about that. But what I really want to do is talk about how to position it. Certainly we have to do this in a responsible manner and minimize the impact. But our point is kind of, I think, really along the line that Frank just made early on is we need to compare it to what's happening today, not compare siting this wind farm versus not doing a wind farm. We have to say, well, what are we doing now? Today, as I mentioned in Ohio, almost 80% coal. And what's happening with every day that those coal plants operate, I think we all know what the impacts are. Here's one plant that's on the closure list, but this was an actual photo we took, not a stock photo when it was starting up. And it's just not a good situation to be in, right? It's just not. Now, one of the studies that backs some of this up, MIT did a study last year, and they looked at the causes of different sectors of burning fossil fuels. And what this graph is a graph of isolated to the electricity generation sector. And they map the particulate matter densities of pollution from that sector. And we're kind of almost in the bullseye here in Ohio. So this is where we suffer from some of as Frank kind of mentioned, our electricity sector really spews an awful lot of pollution in the air that has, not very good impacts. I mean, this photo here, there's a lot of talk about the link with asthma and air pollution. The MIT study said that our electricity power sector in Ohio contributes to 4,000 premature deaths a year, the highest in the country. The per capita rate was, we're happy to be a leader in this, I think. Well, no, wait, maybe we're not happy to be a leader in this. We're right behind Kentucky and West Virginia. So we're number 3 per capita. We're the most premature deaths according to that study of any of them. And all these effects on humans, right, they also have effects on wildlife. And this is what's happening today. So we've got to stop this, and that's the real threat. Now we have to do it in a way that's responsible, but this is kind of what we're looking at and saying, look, we've got to reverse this. We've got to stop that and go to a more responsible, clean energy future that's life friendly, not just wildlife friendly, just friendly to life. And I'll leave you with a little bit of a provocative statement. Frank talked about the endorsements of the projects. We found, it's been an interesting thing, we have a lot of people that support us. And we are pursuing actively a lot of groups of supporters because that's kind of what it takes, the growing kind of some support. But we also have a lot of groups that say, yeah, we like it, but we're not really ready to put our name on it. We're not against it, but we're not ready to support it. And I think my call to action today is, and to everyone we talk to, is that's kind of not good enough. We really need your support to help move this forward. It's not enough to not oppose it. We really need voices that are willing to stand up and say, yes, we need to do this, and we believe in this, and we have some concerns, and we'll work those out, but kind of sign on, not just kind of stand by and watch and see what happens. So that's kind of the thought I'll leave you with, and see Howard's here, so he's probably going to come up next. Right? Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, one thing I wanted to, I'm sorry, one last comment. I meant to, my little prop here. So this little bottle of water, if I think about from the time I left Cleveland yesterday about 7:30 to now, this is the amount of mercury coming out of our Ohio power plants would have filled this bottle of water. So every day, that's how much mercury is being emitted into the air from our plants in Ohio on average. So that's what we need to change. Thanks.
Sure. Good point. Thanks, Dave. Next up is Howard Lerner. And it's great. I mentioned before that it's an honor to be with these two individuals. It's certainly that honor extends to Howard. He is a skilled and accomplished litigator by trade. Serves as the executive director for the Environmental Law and Policy Center based in Chicago, but really makes its presence felt across not just the Midwest, where they have staff and offices, but around the country. Howard, it's a public interest legal advocacy organization, and they also counsel businesses and entrepreneurs across the Midwest. Howard himself has won many awards, including from the U.S. Green Building Council, Cranes, and the German Marshall Fund, I noticed. And so without any further ado, I'm going to ask Howard Lerner to join us. And
thank you.
Absolutely. Just have to hit from the beginning there. And you'll be,
All right, so
is that your first one?
Which one? This one here? Yeah. So
I got it set up. You just hit that.
Hit here?
Yep, and it'll be up there.
Thank you all, and my apologies for walking in a little bit late. I had an old agenda that said 9:15. Oops. Okay. Getting mercury out of the Great Lakes, as Dave talked about, and solving our climate change problems is the moral, the business, the economic, the policy, the political, the technological challenge of our generations. And to do that, we need to reduce pollution from fossil fuel plants, and we need to develop a clean energy future. And the Environmental Law and Policy Center and me personally have been at the forefront of advancing wind power in the Midwest over the last 15 years. We are the American Wind Energy Association's NGO of the Year a few years back. We believe that the Midwest is the Silicon Valley of wind power. And a couple of data points. Iowa is now number 2 in the country for wind power. Illinois is number 4. Minnesota's number 6. There are 600 supply chain businesses in the Midwest supplying wind equipment parts and components, employing people. There is 18,000 megawatts of wind power installed, up and running in the Midwest. That's a win-win-win. Good for jobs, good for economic growth, whether it's in rural communities or manufacturers in urban centers or corporate headquarters in urban centers, and good for the environment. Illinois now has almost 4,000 megawatts of wind power installed. That's about $8 billion of economic investment, more than 10,000 jobs. 14 major wind power companies have their global or North American headquarters in Chicago. If I had said to people in this room, or in a room that's less committed when it comes to the environment, that Illinois would be number 4 in the country, would have 4,000 megawatts of wind power installed, and 14 major corporate headquarters, the polite term would have been, you're a visionary. There are a lot of less polite terms out there would have been said. We are moving and have moved from vision to reality. Okay? So this is not anti-wind, this is pro-wind. The question is, when you do data-driven analysis, what Dave's talking about, and when you look at the imperative of protecting the Great Lakes, where and how do we do this? What makes most sense? So to give you a couple of just by the numbers, and then we'll talk about by the science, and then we'll talk about what it takes to win politically. Dave is talking about a pilot project that is 18 megawatts, 6 wind turbines. Currently, there is 18,000 megawatts of wind power installed on land in the Midwest. In other words, 1,000 to 1. So we're not talking about do we develop wind power to help solve particulates, mercury, climate change problems. There is 1,000 times more wind power currently up and operating than the LEEDCO project as a pilot, if built, would do, as Dave has described. That's what the numbers are here. And almost none of the projects that comprise the 18,000 megawatts are public dollar supported. They are private investment. Okay? You can do just about any type of wind power or solar power project you want if you can get state, federal, and philanthropic money to back it. If we want to get to the scale that's necessary to protect our lakes, to protect our environment, to protect our health, we can't be funding every one of those as a onesie pilot project, okay? We have to get private development moving. That's what's happening, okay? So let's look at, I feel like marketplace, by the numbers, okay? Right. This is the numbers, and this is why there is no private wind development going on in the Great Lakes. When the city of Evanston, north of Chicago, put it out to bid, nobody bid seriously, and why people who were talking about developing on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, as the conversation went forward, basically said, unless you're going to pay us a lot of money, we're not going to be in a position to do it. Okay, far left. The overall cost of wind in the lake is 4 to 5 times more than wind power developed on land. Okay, that's the comparison here you're dealing with. That's the capital costs of doing in the lake, which are about 3 times what it is to do on land, and are the tremendous logistical and operational costs of finding a port or a staging area where you're going to bring a lot of trucks, a lot of trains, a lot of large, big equipment, and then do something that hasn't been done on the Great Lakes yet. Barge it out to a site, as Dan's describing, that's about 7 miles off the shoreline. That is really, really, really expensive. So, if you want to see wind power developed in the Midwest and the Great Lakes that helps solve the problems that we agree is the challenge of our generation, why in the world would you want to put the resources financially into doing it where it is 4 to 5 times more expensive and hugely more complicated in terms of logistics? Secondly, there's a engineering problem. Lake Erie is a relatively shallow lake. Lake Michigan, Lake Superior are very deep lakes. The deeper that you have to go to put up a very heavy, large piece of a wind machine, the harder, the more expensive it is, and you're dealing with equipment that can't have vibrations. You destroy the equipment. So when you're dealing with the Great Lakes, the largest freshwater body in the world, you're dealing with a different situation than wind that's being developed offshore in the North Sea or the Atlantic Ocean that's saltwater. You know, as we all recognize, freshwater freezes more. The freeze and thaw cycle is different than it is in the oceans. That puts more stress, and the depth makes it harder to develop. I'm not saying that's insurmountable. I happen to be a pro-technological environmentalist. We ought to be open to emerging a new technology, whether it's solar or wind, or whether it's doing wind offshore or onshore, and whether there might be new nuclear solutions that people in labs and research facilities, just as they're finding on batteries, can really be better. We ought to hold people's feet to the fire and not just take the latest idea that somebody has, but we ought to be open to those solutions. But when it comes to doing offshore wind in the Great Lakes, from a data-driven perspective, the economics and the numbers don't remotely come close to making any sense whatsoever, and no private business is going to put its money behind it unless it is fully subsidized. I've always thought from an environmental standpoint, it's an important test to see whether people are going to invest their own money or whether they want other people's money. Because when somebody wants other people's money, that tells you something fundamentally about the economics of a program or project. Okay, so that's economics, that's engineering. Why, as the executive director of an environmental group, am I not willing to say, look, if somebody wants to take federal and state funds and philanthropic funds and give it a go, and whether it's in Lake Michigan or Lake Erie, you know, let's give it a try. Because we have spent our careers, our organizations, political capital, our policy capital, we have walked on shards of glass to keep drilling out of the lakes, airports out of the lakes. Dave Ulrich, who just walked in, goes back to the time that I do when there were plans to put airports in Lake Michigan. There are now plans to put party islands in the lakes. And all of us have said, the Great Lakes are a special place. This is not the place to do development. Whether it's from a public trust legal standpoint or the policy standpoint or what we've all fought so hard to do, once we start saying, and I'm not as concerned about, let's give it a try, it's an R&D project with LeadCo. Once we're ready to say, open up the Great Lakes to wind power development, we will not be able politically to hold the line and say, look, it's okay to develop in the Great Lakes because we like wind power. But somebody over there wants to do some drilling for natural gas or build a party island or build an airport. We don't think that's very good. I wish we were as all-powerful that we could make those choices, but we can't and we will not win. We have won time after time because we have said, and the public supports it, it's the Great Lakes is a special place. This is not the place for development. And why in the world would we want to be supporting extensive development of wind power in the Great Lakes when it's 4 to 5 times more expensive than doing it on land, and we have literally millions of acres of land in our region where there is existing transmission infrastructure, where we can do wind power development that is good for the environment, good for economic growth, and good for jobs. And there are thousands of megawatts of wind power there now under development versus what we're talking about here today, something on the order of 18. In other words, 1/1000th of the existing development in the region. That risk isn't worth it to us. And the only winner of lots of proposals to develop wind power in the Great Lakes will be exactly what Dan and I both agree on. It will be the coal industry, because these projects will be highly controversial, and the coal industry will say what they're already saying. See, people object to coal, they object to wind, it's all sort of the same. We don't want to fall into that trick box. We should aggressively develop wind power in the places where it makes most sense and solve the fundamental environmental and climate change problems of our generation. Let's focus, let's be smart, let's do it. Thank you very much. I'll just swing over.
Okay, all right.
Eventually we're going to do Q&A, so
Yeah, we're gonna have Liesl come up now. So
Lisa, come on up and I'll steal your chair.
thank you, Howard. Again, Liesl Clark, I mentioned before, partner with 5 Lakes Energy, and prior to that, the deputy director of the state of Michigan's Energy Office. Liesl.
Thank you, Frank. So I'm just going to go back to Frank's short bio of me to give you some context, as he did already. So, my company is called 5 Lakes Energy. I'm principal and co-founder. We've been around for about 4 years. We're involved in clean energy public policy consulting in the state of Michigan, in the Midwest, and then also nationally. Happy to talk to you about any of that as a sidebar. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is the experience of Michigan from an offshore wind perspective. So much of the work in Michigan around offshore wind happened under the previous administration, and I had the honor of working for about 8 years in state government in a variety of roles, as Frank's described, so I won't go back into that detail. When I was at the governor's office in the Department of Energy and Environmental Growth, we were working particularly on implementing the ARA funding that had come down from the federal government, and a variety of other energy efforts. One of the things that Governor Granholm was particularly interested in was understanding if there were to be offshore wind development in the state, how would it happen in a correct manner. So she organized the Great Lakes Offshore Wind Council under an executive order in 2009. That council was made up of 29 different individuals, 7 from state government in particular, and the rest from different areas that would be involved in offshore wind discussions. So the utilities, of course, transmission companies, shipping companies, navigational companies, the fisheries entities, the tribes were involved, natural resources groups, environmental council. There's an extensive list that I'd be happy to point you to if you're interested. So that group really served 2 purposes. One purpose was to take a look at current statute and regulation and understand if a developer came to the state of Michigan, what would their approach be and what was the appropriate steps that they would need to take in order to do development. So just to back up a little bit, I know that this is a group steeped in water, but just to give you a little bit of a basis of understanding for those of you who might not have it, the bottomlands of the Great Lakes are owned to the middle, where we share them with the other states, but the bottomlands are held in public trust for the people of the state of Michigan. So it's different than Michigan's inland lakes, which are under riparian law. The bottomlands are from the ordinary high water mark, and that's a whole other big long story that many of you probably know a bit about. I won't go into that tangent. From the ordinary high water mark to the middle of the lake is held in trust by the state of Michigan. So what was necessary to understand was, if a developer came to the state, what would that look like? And of course, Michigan operates around the largest percentage of the bottomlands because of where we're located. And so she thought that this was very important to understand what the steps would be.